Welcome to this side event, Closing the Gap, Addressing Wildlife Trafficking of Non-CITES Listed Species. On behalf of the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime and the International Council of Environmental Law, I'd like to extend our gratitude to Brazil for sponsoring this event and to our supporting partners, ADN Capital Foundation, Born Free Foundation, Freeland Foundation, the Jane Goodall Institute and the Wildlife Justice Commission. I'd just like to start the session today by thanking all of you for attending, both in the room here and online. Hybrid events, as we're finding out this morning, can be quite challenging. So I hope everyone will be able to follow and engage with our discussions today. My name is Mark Jones, and I'm Head of Policy at the UK-based wildlife charity Born Free Foundation. We're a co-founder and steering group member of the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime. And we've been working here at the UNODC for the past several years alongside our colleagues to promote the importance of addressing wildlife crime within the international criminal justice system. And I'm very honoured to be moderating this session today. So we'll begin with some opening remarks from John Scanlon, who's joining us online. John is likely known to most of you. Among his many current roles, he's chair of the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime, chair of the UK government's Illegal Wildlife Trade Challenge Fund, and executive president of the International Council of Environmental Law. And his former roles include serving as Secretary General of CITES from 2010 to 2018. Making him uniquely placed to open today's side event. So hopefully over to you, John.
Great, Mark. Can you hear me okay there?
We can hear you in the room, yeah.
That's great. I can't see you very well there, Mark, but I think you're wearing that rhino tie once again.
It's an elephant tie, John.
An elephant tie. Okay, you never let us down. All right, very good. Well, good morning all. Thank you very much to everyone who's joined us in person and online today, and apologies for the slight technical challenges, but they've all been resolved. Fortunately, as you can see, for reasons beyond my control, on this occasion, I have to join you remotely, but we have a fabulous lineup there in Vienna. Good to see you all. Let me start by sincerely thanking Brazil for co-sponsoring today's event, as well as our 6 wonderful co-sponsoring organisations, and they're all either steering group members or international champions of the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime, and Mark has just identified them all. Colleagues, over the past few years, we've seen an increasing level of attention being given to crimes that affect the environment by the UN in Vienna, including wildlife crimes. And we would like to recognise and to thank Brazil for its strong and enduring leadership, including in submitting a draft resolution to this week's Crime Commission meeting on various crimes that affect the environment. And we continue to offer our unwavering support to Brazil in this endeavour. Now, hot off the press, I just got a WhatsApp message, and we hear that the resolution that was submitted by Brazil has now been adopted by the Committee of the Whole. So congratulations to Brazil and all involved. The Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime defines wildlife to include all wild fauna, flora and fungi, animals, plants and fungi, and hence covering 3 of the 9 crimes identified by the UNODC as environmental crimes, namely those related to fishing, logging and wildlife. Colleagues, a fish swimming in the ocean is as much a part of its ecosystem as a tree growing in a forest or an elephant migrating across the savannah. Yet we artificially separate fish and timber trafficking from other forms of wildlife trafficking. And in our view, this is an unnecessary disaggregation, and we're pleased that today we are going to be addressing all wildlife. And UN resolutions on wildlife trafficking also tend to limit themselves to species listed under CITES. But CITES only represents 40,000 of the world's 8.7 million species. And yet we know from UN World Wildlife Crime reports and many other reports and academic articles that there are huge volumes of species being trafficked that are not listed under CITES. In fact, recent reports found that most of the wildlife being trafficked into Europe and USA were non-listed species. Now, it is not okay to steal a country's wildlife just because it is not listed under CITES. Yet this is a serious blind spot in the current approach, with the trafficking of species that are not listed under CITES being disregarded by most destination states, and this needs to change. We need to expand the scope of UN resolutions and any possible future protocol to include any species of wild fauna, flora, or funga that is protected by a source country under its national laws, whether it is listed under CITES or not. And this is an important point of principle. Nationally protected species are often used locally and traded internationally. They may be rare or they may be abundant. But come what may, it is for the source state and its people to determine how their wildlife should be used, not the criminals seeking to illegally exploit these resources for personal gain. Now, amongst other things, the trafficking of nationally protected species is depriving states of revenue and Indigenous peoples and local communities of the opportunity to enjoy the benefits of these valuable natural resources. We need to focus more attention on the destination end of the illegal supply chain. States should make it a criminal offence to import any wildlife or wildlife product into a country if it has been acquired in contravention of the national laws of the source country. Now, if this was done, it would represent a remarkable expression of comity between nations, or put another way, a mutual respect for one another's laws. Now, this principle could readily be expanded to cover all natural resources, including precious metals, which is a matter of concern raised by Brazil at this week's Crime Commission meeting. This approach of respecting nationally protected species, irrespective of their status under international law, has been at the core of the work of the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime over the past 5 years. It's an issue we've raised consistently at Crime Commission meetings, in formal sessions, as well as side events. And we are delighted to be able to put this issue back under the spotlight with our co-sponsors in today's side event. So Mark, big thanks to you for moderating today's event. Sorry I can't be with you. Thank you again to Brazil for your strong leadership, and to all of our wonderful co-sponsors for your support. And finally, thank you to our outstanding speakers, who I am very much looking forward to listening to over the coming hour. Back to you, and thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you for those insightful remarks. So I'm going to ask Steve Connolly to speak next. Steve is the Director of Investigations at the Wildlife Justice Commission. He has over 30 years of law enforcement experience, including with the Australian Federal Police, the New South Wales Police Force, and the New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Service, as well as serving as senior law enforcement expert with the UNODC, developing training packages and undertaking needs assessment in Southeast Asia. Steve, you have the floor.
Thanks. Good morning, everyone, both online and here. Just echoing John's statement that the current system creates opportunities for criminal networks to exploit both domestic and country of origin and destination country legislation to launder wildlife. And I'm just going to give a few examples of that, and then just touch on some of my experience in relation to investigating and prosecuting wildlife crime offence. As an NGO, we always like to start with a video. It's a short one. That video is interesting for a few things. One is that that operation actually resulted in an award for both the investigator in Malaysia and the investigator in India. It was an outstanding example of international cooperation between law enforcement agencies. Second was that the red crown roof turtle was not protected under CITES at that stage, but it was heavily traded, and it was highly sought after within the trade. So it was a result of this seizure and several other seizures that species was uplisted in CITES, and that occurred at the Panama CITES convention. So an example of a species highly valued in the trade but not protected under CITES, but a species that was afforded the highest level of protection in India. Next one. And this is something I found online recently. It came from a report, Scale of Unregulated Trade in Australian Reptiles and Amphibians, 2024, Check and et al. But basically what this found was there's 170 Australian reptile and amphibian species in the international trade, 92 of those in CITES, 59 added in 2022, and 78 species that were unregulated. Now, I would hazard to guess that 99.9% of those reptiles and amphibians were illegally sourced, because it's nearly impossible to legally export Australian fauna out of Australia, unless you're a Class A zoo. So we have a huge number of reptile and amphibian species in the illegal trade, all illegally sourced. Right, so that's an issue not only for Australia, but for those countries that are importing or allowing the import of those species or the possession of those species. We have, I think it's 9 of the 10 most venomous reptiles in the world, venomous snakes. If you get bitten by one of those snakes in one of these countries, you're going to die, because the chance that they've got antivenin for those snakes is very, very low. So this is not only an issue for people who keep these reptiles, but it's an issue for people who do inspections on those reptiles. And now, is it illegal or illegal? What does the paperwork say? So from my experience doing law enforcement, a lot of officers will be reluctant to take action if something is in the grey, right? We need it to be black or white. And not only will the officers be reluctant, the agency will be reluctant, because once you seize live animals, you're responsible for the caring of those live animals, and invariably they die. So, then is the agency responsible should a court determine that those animals were legally imported? Is there a burden on the agency then to pay reparations for those lost animals? And this is just something that happens regularly and all the time. So if you're a law enforcement officer, whether you're at the border or whether you're working inland or away from the border, as we call it, and you come across something like this and you're not sure what the legislation says or what the legislation empowers you to do, you're not going to take action. So at yesterday's side event held by WCS and IFOR, where Erica touched on introducing legislation to support law enforcement, in their activities. So this is not just an enforcement matter, it's a compliance matter. And when it comes to licensing and the permitting of animals and reptiles, it's a huge issue, right? But it also creates opportunities for law enforcement. So firstly, there are gaps in the current legal framework which need to be addressed. But when we address those gaps, we need to make it simple and easy for enforcement to take action. And I just want to read a piece of legislation that I used frequently when I was with the National Parks and Wildlife Service as a special investigator. And it's along the lines of making the legislation easy to enforce. And it comes in the definition. So in Australia, a reptile, this is under the National Parks and Wildlife Act of 1974 in New South Wales, a reptile means a snake, lizard, crocodile, tortoise, turtle, or other member of the class Reptilia, whether native, introduced, or imported. So if you've got a snake and you don't have a permit, you're done. It's very simple. And it made enforcement and compliance really easy. So that's something that we need to look at and work towards when we draft this legislation. Make it so it's actually enforceable. And at the end of the day, there are issues around compliance that probably go beyond the legislation. And these are some of the issues that we had to address in Australia. One was trying to establish a baseline for those species that were in the trade. So what National Parks and Wildlife did is they introduced a moratorium for people to declare all exotic fauna. Now, obviously, there was a lot of pushback about that because it literally legalized the possession of that fauna, but it had positive aspects that were, one, we knew what was actually in the trade. Two, it enabled compliance. And that compliance includes the ability to search a premises other than that used for residing 24 hours a day without notice and without a warrant. Right? Enabled them to produce, it forced them to produce documentation in respect to breeding. So these are the sort of things we want to look at. You know, if we're going to create a system, we need to enable it. So we need to draft it and organize it so that law enforcement can actually implement the laws and do it so in a way that is more strategic, because often with a moratorium, the people who are the biggest in the trade come forward and register their animals and actually tells you where to target your enforcement activities. But also it creates a system and a process whereby you actually know what's out there. Now, often there are people that don't register these things, but the simple fact is then when you identify that and you seize it, it's an offence straight up. And one of the other things to consider is when we do introduce legislation, that we look at ways to provide capacity building around compliance, because compliance is not easy, right? We need to train these people, we need to equip these people, and we also need to do it at both ends of the supply chain, right? It's no good having a system in one country and there's no system in the other country, because what we're trying to do is stop the laundering of wildlife. And obviously this is applicable to other species, timber and fish, but in particular wildlife. And one of the things that we used, and was a great investigative tool, was requiring the DNA sampling of the offspring of these, often birds and reptiles. Because once you've established that, they can't trade if they haven't got a DNA certificate to prove there's the offspring. And that's a great way to stop laundering. Yes, it's expensive, but you pass that cost on to the license holder, right? Because if they want to trade in these animals, it's incumbent upon them to do these things to ensure that the species are being legally obtained. And that's pretty well it.
Thank you, Steve. All the work that you're doing is amazing work. Our next speaker is Gustavo Carneiro. Gustavo is a Brazilian diplomat and has served in Pakistan, South Africa, and in Vienna, where he worked as Brazil's delegate for UNODC issues for 4 years. He's been Deputy General Coordinator for the fight against transnational crime at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs since 2022. Gustavo, you're very welcome. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Mark, and I apologize for the delay. We were actually just finishing the approval of our resolution at the Committee of the Whole, and I'm glad to say it's passed by consensus. And that's one of the things that I would like to talk about. As we have discussed with John and the colleagues in the preparation for this event, I think I will be the outlier and non-technical person to speak with. And I'd like to talk a bit more about the diplomatic process and how Brazil is seeing the issue of environmental crimes. This has been since the beginning of President Lula's administration. The fight against environmental crime has become a priority and has been treated as a priority in our country. And we have been doing work at all levels to fight environmental crime, since the most operational local level until what we've been trying to do here at the diplomatic level. And so internally, we have tried to reinforce the operational capacity of our law enforcement by giving them both more autonomy to fight transnational crime and environmental crimes, resources, support, logistical support from armed forces in the Amazon region, and with the special focus on illegal deforestation and illegal mining as well. We have been also internally trying to reinforce our normative side, increasing penalties for environmental crimes, including environmental crimes as a special category to be investigated by the federal police in an amendment to the Constitution that's currently in Congress. And also reviewing the proceedings of the gold supply chain in order to reinforce our capacity to supervise that. We have also been working in our region with countries, especially in the Amazon, through the organization of the Treaty of Amazonian Cooperation, ACTO in English, where we have established a special commission to discuss public security, and environmental crime obviously is a high priority there. This has been decided late 2023, and we're having a late first meeting of the commission, probably in a month, within the next month. And together with that, our federal police is establishing as an international police cooperation center in Manaus, the capital of the Amazon state, which will gather both national bodies of all the Amazonian provinces in Brazil, and with invited liaison officers from all Amazonian countries as well, as an effort to both have a command and control center and to act as a technical cooperation facility. And that should be inaugurated in the next few months as well, to start working in June and inauguration in August probably. And then we get to the multilateral level. We have, since these efforts internally have begun, we as Ministry of Foreign Affairs have started to look at what we're doing in our region and think, okay, what should we do at the multilateral level? When we started doing the assessment of what's been done, we felt that there has been more than a decade of attempts or calls for countries to do something at the multilateral level, but not much action. So the situation we thought was still of difficulties in international cooperation, in international legal and law enforcement cooperation that's reported by our law enforcement agencies, of fragmentation in criminalization, as we know, and of the approaches to these different types of crimes. And then we see that there's strong mobilization as well from the civil society, which we thought was excellent and which we value very much. We were aware of all the suggestions and the proposals by civil society on the fourth protocol, as is mentioned, on wildlife, and we started discussing the issue internally. And what we felt was that it was a necessity, but also that we should go further than wildlife trafficking per se, both because, of course, for Brazil, illegal mining is also a priority, and we think that it's also a huge illegal market that fuels other types of crimes. So it's a needed area. And also because if we were to move on with one issue only, we would end up losing an opportunity of having a more comprehensive approach, which would make things also easier here at the multilateral level. And that's when we decided that we would have an ambitious position in order to try and make this move a little bit more in the multilateral arena by proposing the negotiation of protocols on specific environmental crimes, trafficking fauna, flora, and illegal mining. Basically, because we think that there needs to be a baseline of harmonious criminalization among countries, so that we can give the next steps in terms of international cooperation, fighting money laundering, and so on and so forth. And as we have seen, the approach that has been taken over the years is not leading us to that harmonious criminalization. So last year, when we started discussing this, we noticed also that even though it has been a call from the civil society for a while, and we commend you on that, many countries actually did not, and still do not have a position, and we're actually not yet thinking seriously about the issue. And that's one of the challenges we have, and we have had for the past year, I would say, when we started proposing that here in Vienna. And we ended up, mostly, I think, because of that situation and the lack of awareness and the lack of critical mass, we have created the expert group in the last talk, and which is, of course, a step towards something bigger. And then this year at the CCPCJ, we decided to propose another resolution, because also we felt the need exactly to, again, raise awareness politically, raise discussions in Vienna, and make sure that everyone and every country is thinking about that. I as a bureaucrat, I know that we will only move and make a decision once you have a paper in front of you. So one of the objectives of us having a resolution at this CCPCJ was exactly that. We have to discuss this and we have to make decisions. So you need to put this on paper. And I will try not to take too much time, but I just would like to discuss a little bit about the results and our experience in this session with the draft resolution that was literally just approved by consensus as well. Starting by the negative side, I think we faced difficulties, of course, but I wouldn't say that there were more than the regular difficulties of a draft resolution. But we do see that there still needs to be more discussions and more awareness in order for countries to be able to position themselves. And one of the things we notice is that in many places and in many conversations we have with other partners, there is many countries still, I would say, do not have be it an agency, an organ, or a person even that coordinates internally the issue of environmental crimes. It is very fragmented internally as well, which makes it harder then to take it to the next level out at the multilateral level. On the positive side, I think that by having the discussions this week, we've managed to push the boundaries a little bit on that. And we have managed to stir up discussions of a bit more of a deeper nature, let's say. We have been able to agree on paragraphs that were completely new, some of them leading to the description of conducts that should be criminalized, which we believe is an advancement. We have been able to recognize in the resolution the principle of shared responsibility on tackling these crimes and the need for a balanced approach as well between demand and supply. So all of these we believe were gains that we had by doing this. And I think we will arrive, at least Brazil, and I think the other delegations that participated fully in the discussions, will arrive next month at the IEG with a much more clear view of where we are and what needs to be discussed more. And we felt that clearly one of the most important discussions was the issue of a definition of what could be included as crimes that affect the environment. And that's been a discussion that we've had in Brazil as internally, and many countries are having. So we've managed to give clear political priorities to wildlife trafficking, illegal mining, and also to some extent to the trafficking waste. But I do know that we have noticed that the discussion on other forms of crimes that affect the environment might be something that will be raised in the IEG. And that's something we believe is positive also, because on our way to a protocol, I think the first decision we need to make is a protocol of protocols, what should be included there. And that's a first discussion that we are stirring up, and we hope to move forward quickly. So thank you. I hope it didn't take too much time.
Thank you very much. We all very much benefit from hearing what's going on both nationally in Brazil and the efforts that you're making at an international level. Thank you for joining us straight from the committee of the whole, and congratulations on getting the resolution adopted by that committee. So thank you very much. Our next speaker is Vanessa Negrini. Now, Vanessa is the Director of the Department for the Protection, Defence and Rights of Animals at Brazil's Ministry of Environment and Climate Change. She holds a PhD in Communication and Culture Policies and works at the University of Brasilia, where she leads research and teaches on animal rights and intersectionality.
Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, I would like to begin by thanking the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime, the International Council of Environmental Law, and the other partner organizations for promoting this timely and crucial discussion. It is an honor to represent Brazil at this event and to share our perspective on one of the most urgent challenges in the protection of global biodiversity: the trafficking of species not listed under CITES. Brazil is a mega-diverse country. We are home to more than 120,000 described species, including approximately 9,000 vertebrates and around 46,000 plant species, the greatest biodiversity on the planet. Our legislation, especially the Environmental Crimes Law and the Wildlife Protection Law, ensures that all native wild species are protected. Their collection, management, transport, or commercialization are prohibited, except with express authorization from the competent authorities. However, less than 2% of these species are currently protected, listed in the CITES appendices. This means that thousands of highly endemic, rare, or recently described species are not covered by international trade regulations. This represents a critical gap in the international legal framework, exploited by wildlife trafficking networks. The dynamic is simple yet harmful. Specimens are illegally captured in Brazil, smuggled across borders, often passing through intermediary countries. And once abroad, they enter markets where their trade is considered legal simply because they are not listed under CITES. Thus, a legal paradox is created. What constitutes a serious environmental crime in a biodiversity-rich country of origin is treated as a legal transaction in the destination countries. And it is important to remember that CITES, created in 1973, although extremely important, was structured based on trade criteria. As a result, many biologically vulnerable species, due to restricted distribution, small populations, or lack of data, do not meet the necessary criteria for listing, even though they are at risk. And even when they do meet the criteria, the process can take many years. Many Brazilian species, especially reptiles, amphibians, ornamental fish, orchids, bromeliads, and insects, have high commercial value in international markets and are frequently targeted by traffickers with little or no oversight in the importing countries. The lack of a requirement to prove legal origin further weakens the ability to prevent and punish these crimes. Even if destination countries strengthen their laws and classify wildlife trafficking as a serious crime, The absence of CITES listing prevents coordinated international action. The result is ultimately cross-border impunity, the weakening of national conservation efforts, and the devaluation of domestic legal systems. In light of this, Brazil has taken an active role in promoting multilateral solutions based on environmental justice, the sovereignty of mega-diverse countries, and the rights of future generations. Among these efforts, we highlight Brazil's support for the negotiation of a new protocol or new protocols on crimes that affect the environment within the framework of the United Nations Convention against transnational organized crime. A legally binding instrument like this would seek to harmonize definitions and penalties for environmental crimes among countries, establish robust mechanisms for legal and technical cooperation, facilitate the sharing of information and the tracking of legal trade routes, and apply the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities in the fight against environmental crimes. A new protocol or new protocols is essential to close legal loopholes like the one we discussed today and to ensure that the biodiversity of the global south is not continually plundered under the guise of omissions in the international legal regime. Brazil reaffirms its commitment to multilateralism, to science-based policies, and to strengthening an international legal framework that is up to the gravity of the environmental crisis we face. Expanding the scope of international law to cover species not listed under CITES is fundamental to curbing the trafficking of fauna and flora, protecting biodiversity in all its complexity, and ensuring the preservation of the ecological balances essential for life on our planet. Thank you very much.
So we're now going to hear from Daniel Kachelreis. Daniel is an expert on oceans, fisheries, wildlife law, and a member of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law and the technical support group of the the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime. His previous roles include executive director of a non-profit law firm and the Marine Species Officer of the CITES Secretariat. Over to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you to the initiative and all the champions and co-sponsors that made this event possible. I'm very glad I'm speaking after Stephen and Gustavo because Gustavo already mentioned a little bit about the overall effort to improve the international approach to crimes against the environment. And my presentation is more to offer some considerations of what it would mean and what choices would need to be made if that effort were to include marine species, especially with a focus on non-CITES listed marine species. And I'm afraid I might pose more questions than offer answers, but I hope it's still helpful. Next slide, please. And one more. So this is from the recent UNODC World Wildlife Crime Report. The diversity of species recorded in seizures, and I've put sort of orange highlights around some of the species groups that at least are partially marine or fully marine. Interesting, for example, bivalve mollusks. There are 49 species listed under CITES, but this most likely also includes species not listed under CITES. In terms of marine species, what's listed on CITES is giant clams and the rock boring date mussel, both of which are traded illegally. Then on sea snails, there's 79 species of snails listed under CITES. It's very difficult to figure out which ones of those are marine. Obviously, queen conch is quite well-known Appendix 2 listed species, but then abalone, for example, is known to be illegally traded and not listed under CITES. What I find quite striking when looking at this picture is that it does not include fish. And that is acknowledged in the report that the CCPCJ-based evidence does not include trafficking in timber and fisheries, and some other large trade sectors. Next slide, please. And so this brings us a little bit to the dichotomy that John already mentioned in his introduction, that fish are sometimes sort of excluded from a conversation when we have a wildlife focus. Tanya, who's in the room, did a review of national legislation of where fish is explicitly included in the definition of wildlife, where it is implied, where there's no definition, and then a few cases where it's also explicitly not included. And sort of my first point would be that if states were to consider an instrument or a protocol to advance the approach to combating crimes against the environment, and they would want that to have synergies with marine species, it would be very important to address the dichotomy and make sure that fish are explicitly included. Next slide, please. So it's also already been mentioned by Vanessa that there are a lot of species that are endangered that do not meet the CITES criteria. CITES has, in addition to status criteria, it has trade criteria. Even if a species meets the CITES criteria, especially when it's a marine species, there's quite a high level of evidence that needs to be provided to support a listing. And of course, these bubbles are not to scale, but it's fair to assume that only a very small amount of CITES of endangered marine wildlife is actually listed on the CITES. There is more that is nationally protected in individual countries, but not on CITES. And then the overall amount of species that are important for their ecosystems that are endangered might be neither nationally protected nor under CITES. And this is just looking at it from a species lens, because we are talking about non-CITES listed species. There's the other consideration as well, talking about species that are not endangered or not listed on CITES or not nationally protected, but are harvested in a manner that is illegal in the source country, that might also need to be taken into account. Of course, that creates a slightly different problem for a customs officer at the border, because knowing the identity of the species would not suffice to give him the grounds to confiscate, but there would need to be some form of understanding the chain of custody and if there has been illegal activity in the chain of custody. So it's sort of an additional complication, but I didn't want to lose that consideration here. Next slide, please. So when we include fish, we of course get into that interface with what we call IUU fishing, illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. And there's no great definition. The FAO has the International Plan of Action on IUU, and generally it sort of puts things that take place outside established legal and management frameworks into that IUU bucket. But it's important to emphasize that, of course, not all of these activities are illegal, as it's explicit in the title. And so finding tools, sort of going a little bit to what Stephen said, finding ways that make it very straightforward to separate the illegal from the unreported and unregulated would be really helpful. John has made the point in the past that CITES, for example, does offer that clear distinction. Either something is legal and regulated and reported in the CITES trade database, and then it clearly is the illegal part of IUU. But for non-CITES listed species, that is not the case. So an instrument that gives a clear scope of what conduct should be criminalized might be really helpful also to filter that I from the UU in this case. Next slide. Talking about IUU, here in Vienna at UNODC, it's important to mention fisheries crime, which has been described as an ill-defined legal concept to a large, referring to a large range of illegal activities in the fisheries sector. They frequently transnational and organized in nature, which include illegal fishing, document fraud, drug trafficking, and money laundering. And one click, please. And there's a similar analysis or framework proposed by FAO. And I think for this community, it's important that there's quite a lot of activities that are of relevance to the discussions you're having here that factor into that are adjacent to IUU fishing. Next slide, please. So if states were to embark on developing a new tool, instrument, protocol, and wanted to include marine species, including non-CITES listed marine species, one of the things that would be important to consider is that in addition to the routes you're already considering, if fishing is included, there are other routes. Fishing vessels landing in fisheries ports might also include some species that fall under wildlife trafficking. There's transshipment at sea, so it might be a vessel capturing species that are protected in a country, in that country's EEZ, then bringing them to the high seas, transshipping that to another vessel at high seas, and then that vessel landing in your port. And it might also be coming in through traditional routes. And of course, compared to some of the other types of wildlife crime, there are already some actors that are also thinking about this. There's port inspectors, there's the FAO Port State Measures Agreement to combat IUU. And so it's really important to both take those routes into account, but also talk to the existing stakeholders that are working on these issues, for example, fisheries and port authorities. Next slide, please. And then maybe just one additional point to consider. When you look at the UNODC guide on drafting legislation to combat wildlife crime, it takes its definition from trafficking, from CITES definition of trade, which next to export, import, and re-export includes introduction from the sea. So that is the transport of a specimen from areas beyond national jurisdiction into a state. And how that would expand the scope potentially to activities taking place in areas beyond national jurisdiction is worth considering. Because we're talking about criminalization, about crime, it's very much through the lens of the flag state. So are there activities like the harvesting of protected species in areas beyond national jurisdiction that under the national legislation of the flag state would qualify to as trafficking of marine wildlife? And then how do you approach that? Next slide. So my key takeaways and considerations to leave you with would be that efforts to improve international response to wildlife crime should explicitly extend to fish. As has been said by other speakers before, including trafficking of marine wildlife not listed under CITES would, for example, help support source countries' domestic protections. Doing so would mean considering additional routes, types of trade, and reaching out to additional stakeholders. And a new tool could help delimitate which conduct falls under wildlife trafficking, which conduct should be criminalized, and provide an additional platform for cooperation, mutual assistance, and technical assistance. I hope that's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Daniel, for sharing your insights. I realised that we're just coming up to the top of the hour. We were a little bit delayed starting, so apologies for that. But if you're able to bear with us for perhaps an additional 5 or 10 minutes, I can open up the floor for any questions from the room. We have had a couple of questions submitted online, but if we start in the room, does anybody have any questions they'd like to put to our panel? Justin.
Thanks everybody for the interesting presentations. I think mine is mostly directed at Gustavo. One for you. I work for the Environmental Investigation Agency, which is the only NGO that focuses on crime and abuse across all 3 of the areas of the triple planetary crisis. So obviously we're interested in a broad approach to this issue. You, in my opinion, quite rightly said that you didn't think that focusing on wildlife crime alone was sufficient, but you also didn't go as far as, say, the 21 areas in the EU directive or the 9 areas under the UNODC crimes that affect the environment. I just wondered what your rationale was for those sort of 2 or 3 areas you focused on.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, our rationale was both national and in terms of our national priorities, what we see as most relevant national crime. Also on what we see of estimates in terms of costs for those modalities of crime. And also what we feel are more, it's hard to put it in a different way, but perhaps more tradable or trafficable modalities of environmental crimes, because you can, I think the UNODC includes sometimes pollution crimes, noise pollution. Of course, that can be cross-border, but rarely I think there's an organized criminal group that will do this from one country to the other. So we feel that these are the most clear-cut transnational crime, transnational organized crime modalities, but we are also, we recognize that there are others, as the resolution recognized the case for waste trafficking, for instance.
Thank you.
Yes.
I have a question also for Gustavo and someone from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. In the run-up to the IEG, what support do you think NGOs can provide to the states that are participating in order to make the process more successful?
Thank you, Simon. I think that's been a concern of ours, actually, the lack of civil society participation in the IEG, right? We've been exploring with also some of you how to best organize that to guarantee that there is at least these sorts of interactions between the delegations and civil society. And our feel is that, again, if you take the context that we have, in which many countries do not have developed positions, or many countries are focused solely on their own realities in terms of environmental crimes, I think civil society has a role of expanding a bit those views and bringing different ideas to the floor. I, for instance, had no idea about the illegal fisheries problems that were raised just now, and this is something that we have to be mindful of when we start discussing. And as I said, the IEG will be a very important opportunity to narrow down what is the most important, what should be considered within the UNTOC, what should not come. So it's key that we listen to people who have been thinking about this for much more time than we have, as is the case.
Thank you. Any further questions in the room? I have one that's coming online, but perhaps I can direct this to you, Steve. Do you have any experience with countries that have legislation that criminalises the import of illegally sourced wildlife? And could you explain how such legislation works in practice from an enforcement perspective?
Yeah, I think that the easiest one to point to would be the US Lacey Act. It makes the illegal sourcing of wildlife in a particular country illegal if that wildlife makes its way to the US or has a US nexus. And how does that work in practice? Having worked quite a bit with US Fish and Wildlife, their Special Investigations Unit on transnational traffickers, often there is a US nexus, particularly around the financial side of things. And, establishing that nexus is obviously crucial for a successful prosecution, but there are ways to do that. And often that way involves the financial flows, which, we talk about following the money, parallel financial investigations. It's something that I know that we've been promoting for years, UNODC has been promoting for years. It really is a way to find out who the people are that are really pulling the strings behind transnational organised wildlife crime and other crime types. So, often there is a financial element to that sort of investigation.
Thank you, Steve. Yes. Go ahead, please introduce yourself.
I'm Giovanni Broussard. I'm the acting head of the UNODC program on environmental crimes. Just following up on what Steve just said, I was wondering, Steve, if you think that in a potential future protocol to the UNTOC, that notion of criminalizing the import of species should be something that you would recommend being adopted by all countries. And I think that also for Brazil, it would be useful to hear what's the view of some organizations on that.
I think it has to absolutely be included, because quite simply the trade in non-CITES species dwarfs the trade in CITES species. So unless you start looking at the legality, the chain of custody of this sort of stuff, you're never going to get a handle on what's going on. It only gets to CITES when it becomes, rarer, basically, or, the trade endangers the existence of the species. So, it works in the favour of criminal networks to push species to extinction, because then the value of that commodity goes higher and higher. And we often see the movement very quickly into non-CITES species once they're exhausting the stocks of CITES species, whether it's fish, timber, or wildlife. So I think it's an essential part of any protocol that it captures that.
Can I make just a
Yes,
small comment that might be also interesting, is that one of the things that we managed to include in the resolution was precisely that. So we mentioned that countries should, with all the caveats that you can imagine, establish the criminalization of the capture, collection, exposure for sale, acquisition, import, export, purchase, sale, delivery, transportation, transfer, receipt, acquisition, possession, or holding of specimens without legal authorization. So this is already included in the resolution. I think it's a good first step.
Sounds like a lot of words, but it's actually when you're trying to enforce the law, it's those sort of words that you have to have. Because a lawyer will find a way out if it's not clearly stipulated. Not there's any other lawyers. Cool.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. I will have to draw us to a close, I'm afraid. We're overrunning, and I'm aware there is another meeting in this room in about 20 minutes' time. So today we've focused on the legal loophole that enables the trafficking of nationally protected species that are not covered by CITES, and the need for the international community to address this critical issue. I think bringing together government policymakers, enforcement agencies, legal experts, and civil society enables us to shed light on the devastating consequences of this gap in international law, which include biodiversity loss, economic loss to source countries, threats to indigenous peoples and local communities, and the undermining of the rule of law. And we've also explored potential legal solutions, including the possible benefits of a new protocol under the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organised Crime that would include or could include an obligation to criminalise the import of any wildlife or wildlife products acquired in violation of the source country's national laws. And this is something that the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime has been promoting since its inception. So by fostering an open dialogue in this issue, I hope we've helped to build upon the existing momentum for international action to close this regulatory gap in support of wildlife protection efforts at national and international levels as a key component of efforts to halt or reverse the loss of biodiversity and protect human and animal health and well-being. And by doing so, help to progress a little bit towards the fulfillment of established international agreements. So a big thank you to Brazil and our co-sponsors, to our distinguished speakers, and to everyone who's joined us here in Vienna and tuned in online from wherever you are in the world. Apologies for some of the technical glitches that we had earlier on, but I believe that a recording of the event will be made. We'll try and edit that recording so we make it run a little bit more smoothly. With that, I wish you a good rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you to all the panelists. Great presentations.
Thank you, John. No,